Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one nobody suspects. She looked like any other college student enjoying a Friday night out, but beneath her casual appearance lay years of specialized training that could neutralize threats most people couldn't even imagine. What started as a simple misunderstanding in a crowded bar would soon reveal that appearances can be fatally deceptive, and that some people you should never, ever underestimate. The bass from the speakers vibrated through the worn wooden floor of Murphy's pub as Sarah Chen nursed her beer at the far end of the bar. To everyone around her, she appeared to be just another 20-something graduate student unwinding after a long week. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain black t-shirt that gave no hint of the lean, powerful muscle beneath. Her dark eyes scanned the room with what seemed like casual interest, but she was actually cataloging exits, potential weapons, and threat assessments of every patron in the establishment. Sarah had been undercover for 3 months now, embedded as a graduate student in molecular biology at the nearby university. Her real identity was known only to her handler and a select few in the Pentagon. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Army Special Operations, had spent the last 8 years of her life becoming one of the most lethal operatives in the military's most classified units. She could speak 6 languages fluently, had master's-level knowledge in chemistry and explosives, and could kill a man with her bare hands in 12 different ways. But tonight, she was just Sarah the grad student, maintaining her cover while gathering intelligence on a suspected terrorist cell operating out of the university's research facilities. The mission had been routine so far. She'd successfully infiltrated the target group, gained the trust of key suspects, and was scheduled to extract crucial information about their planned attack within the next week. Everything was going according to plan until Corporal Jake Morrison walked into Murphy's pub with his Marine buddies, already 3 beers deep from their previous stop. Jake was everything Sarah typically avoided in her cover identity. Loud, aggressive, and carrying himself with the kind of swagger that came from knowing he could handle himself in a fight. He stood 6'2" with the kind of build that came from years of military training and a dedication to physical fitness that bordered on obsession. His blonde hair was regulation short, and even in civilian clothes, everything about him screamed military. He'd been discharged from active duty 6 months ago after taking shrapnel in his leg during a deployment in Syria, and he was still adjusting to civilian life in ways that often involved too much alcohol and too little patience. Sarah noticed Jake and his group the moment they entered. Military bearing was something she could spot from across a crowded room, and she made a mental note to avoid any interaction with them. The last thing she needed was to blow her cover because some drunk Marines recognized something familiar in her posture or the way she carried herself. She turned slightly away from them and focused on her phone, pretending to scroll through social media while actually reviewing encrypted messages from her handler. For the first hour, her strategy worked perfectly. Jake and his friends claimed a table near the pool tables and seemed content to drink beer and tell increasingly loud stories about their service days. Sarah continued her surveillance of 2 graduate students from the chemistry department who were sitting at a table near the window, discussing what appeared to be research schedules, but was actually coded language about acquiring certain chemical compounds. She was recording their conversation through a sophisticated listening device, disguised as a smartphone case, when everything went wrong. It started when one of Jake's friends, a stocky ex-Marine named Tony Rixai, spotted an attractive redhead at the bar and decided to try his luck. The woman politely declined his advances, but Tony had consumed enough alcohol to take rejection personally. His voice got louder, his persistence more aggressive, and soon the entire bar was uncomfortably aware of the situation unfolding. Sarah watched from her peripheral vision as the bartender, a middle-aged man named Frank who'd been serving drinks for 20 years, tried to diplomatically defuse the situation. But Tony was beyond reason, and when the redhead tried to leave, he grabbed her arm to stop her. That's when Jake got involved. Under normal circumstances, Jake might have been the voice of reason among his friends. But he'd been struggling with his transition to civilian life, dealing with phantom pain from his wounded leg and the psychological adjustment that came with no longer having a clear mission and purpose. The alcohol had amplified his frustration, and when he saw Tony harassing the woman, something inside him snapped. Instead of calming his friend down, Jake escalated the situation. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and strode over to where Tony was still holding the woman's arm. But instead of pulling Tony away, Jake made a critical error in judgment. In his intoxicated state, he misread the situation entirely. The woman had been struggling to get away from Tony's grip, and when Jake saw her pull back suddenly, his alcohol-clouded brain interpreted her movement as aggressive. What happened next would later be described differently by every witness in the bar, but the basic facts were these. Jake, thinking the woman was attacking his friend, grabbed her shoulder to pull her away from Tony. She stumbled backward, hit a bar stool, and fell to the floor. Jake, rather than helping her up or apologizing, stood over her and began yelling about how she needed to calm down and stop causing trouble. The entire bar went quiet. Frank the bartender was already reaching for the phone to call the police. Several other patrons were standing up, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. And Sarah Chen, who had been successfully maintaining her cover for 3 months, found herself in an impossible position. Every instinct she had as both a soldier and a human being told her to intervene. She'd spent years training to protect innocent civilians, and watching a drunk Marine intimidate a woman who'd done nothing wrong went against everything she believed in. But intervening would mean risking her cover, potentially compromising a mission that could save hundreds of lives, and exposing herself to the kind of scrutiny that could unravel months of careful preparation. She tried to stay seated. She really did. She told herself that the situation would resolve itself, that other patrons would step in, that the bartender would handle it. But when Jake leaned down and poked the woman in the shoulder while continuing to berate her, Sarah's training overrode her tactical judgment. She stood up smoothly, her movement so fluid and controlled that it drew Jake's attention immediately. Something about the way she moved registered as different, dangerous even, but in his current state, he was too drunk and too angry to process the warning signs properly. "Hey," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying despite the background noise of the bar. "That's enough." Jake turned toward her, and Sarah could see the moment when he made his assessment. Small woman, probably a college student, definitely not a threat. His expression shifted from surprise to annoyance, the kind of look men like him gave to women who dared to challenge them in public. "Mind your own business, sweetheart," Jake said, his words slightly slurred. "This doesn't concern you." Sarah took 3 steps closer, positioning herself between Jake and the redhead, who was still on the floor looking shaken but uninjured. To everyone watching, it looked like a brave but foolish gesture from a young woman who was about to get herself in serious trouble. They had no idea they were watching one of the most dangerous people in the building calmly assess a threat and decide how to neutralize it with minimal collateral damage. "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah replied, her voice still quiet but carrying a tone that Jake should have recognized as dangerous. "You need to back away and let her get up." Jake's friends had noticed the confrontation by now. Tony, still drunk but beginning to sober up as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to grab Jake's arm. "Come on, man, let's just go. It's not worth it." But Jake was beyond listening to reason. The combination of alcohol, pain medication for his leg, and months of pent-up frustration had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. Instead of backing down, he stepped closer to Sarah, using his height and bulk to try to intimidate her. "You want to be a hero, little girl?" he said, his voice getting louder. "You think you can tell a Marine what to do?" Sarah's assessment of the situation was clinical and precise. Jake Morrison, approximately 6'2", 210 pounds, intoxicated but still dangerous due to his military training, favoring his left leg slightly, indicating an old injury that could be exploited. Aggressive posture but sloppy technique due to alcohol impairment. Surrounded by friends who might intervene but were showing signs of wanting to de-escalate rather than fight. Threat level, manageable but escalating. Recommended response, minimal force, quick neutralization, maintain cover story. "I'm not trying to be a hero," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone now that made several nearby patrons unconsciously step back. "I'm just asking you to be a decent human being and let her get up." Jake made his final mistake then. Whether it was the alcohol, the frustration, or simply the toxic combination of pride and poor judgment that had gotten him in trouble before, he decided that this small woman needed to be taught a lesson about respecting Marines. He raised his hand to shove Sarah backward, the same way he'd grabbed the redhead earlier. It was meant to be intimidating rather than truly harmful, a display of dominance that would put this uppity college girl in her place and restore his authority over the situation. His hand never made contact. Sarah moved like water, flowing around his arm so smoothly that Jake's momentum carried him forward into empty space. Before he could recover his balance, she had stepped behind him and applied pressure to specific nerve points on his shoulder that she'd learned during her training in advanced combat techniques. Jake found himself suddenly on his knees, his right arm completely numb and useless, with no clear understanding of how he'd gotten there. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, and to most of the bar patrons, it looked like Jake had simply stumbled and fallen. Only those with military or law enforcement training would have recognized the precise, economical movements that had neutralized a larger opponent without apparent effort. Sarah immediately stepped back and assumed a posture that suggested concern rather than aggression. "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" she said loudly enough for the entire bar to hear. "You must have tripped. Here, let me help you up." Jake, still confused and dealing with the numbness in his arm, tried to get back to his feet. The pressure points Sarah had manipulated would cause temporary paralysis, but he didn't understand what had happened. All he knew was that he'd tried to push the small woman, and now he was on the floor with his arm not working properly. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "I didn't do anything," Sarah replied, maintaining her cover perfectly. "You stumbled. Maybe you should sit down for a few minutes." But Jake wasn't buying it. Even through the alcohol haze, some part of his military training was telling him that what had just happened wasn't accidental. The way she'd moved, the precision of her response, the fact that his arm still wasn't working properly, none of it added up to a simple stumble. He tried to grab her with his left hand, but Sarah was already moving. This time, she couldn't disguise her response as easily. Jake was bigger, trained, and despite his intoxication, he was beginning to fight with the kind of systematic aggression that marked him as someone with combat experience. Sarah found herself in the worst possible situation for an undercover operative. A public fight with a trained opponent who might recognize her skills if she used them fully, but who was dangerous enough that she couldn't afford to hold back too much. She settled for a compromise that would haunt her later. Instead of using the lethal techniques she'd been trained in, she relied on her speed and precision to stay ahead of Jake's attacks while appearing to struggle more than she actually was. To the watching crowd, it looked like a brave but overmatched young woman trying to defend herself against an aggressive drunk. Jake swung wildly with his left hand, and Sarah ducked under the punch while stepping inside his reach. She drove her elbow upward into his solar plexus with just enough force to drive the wind out of his lungs without causing serious damage. Jake doubled over, gasping, and Sarah immediately stepped back with her hands raised in a defensive posture. "Please just leave me alone," she said loudly, playing to the crowd. "I don't want to fight you." But Jake was beyond reasoning now. The combination of physical pain, confusion, and wounded pride had triggered something primal in him. He straightened up and charged at her like a linebacker, intending to tackle her to the ground where his size advantage would be decisive. Sarah had a split second to make a choice that would define everything that came after. She could continue trying to maintain her cover, risking serious injury or worse, or she could end the fight with the kind of definitive action that would save her but potentially expose her true identity. She chose survival. As Jake rushed toward her, Sarah planted her left foot and pivoted, using his momentum against him. She caught his leading arm and used a hip throw that sent all 210 pounds of Jake Morrison flying through the air to crash into a table full of empty beer bottles. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood echoed through the suddenly silent bar. Jake hit the ground hard and didn't get up immediately. When he finally rolled over and tried to stand, Sarah could see in his eyes that something had changed. The confusion was gone, replaced by a look of recognition that made her blood run cold. "You're military," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet bar. "That was a combat throw. Who the hell are you?" Sarah's mind raced through possible responses, cover stories, ways to deflect his suspicion. But before she could answer, Jake's friend Tony stepped forward with his phone in his hand. "I got it all on video," Tony announced to the bar. "Started recording when things got crazy. This whole thing's going online." Sarah felt her carefully constructed cover identity crashing down around her. In the age of social media and viral videos, there was no way to contain this situation. Within hours, footage of her fighting would be circulating on every platform, analyzed by millions of viewers, including people who might recognize her techniques or her face from her military service. The redhead, who had been helped to her feet by other patrons, approached Sarah with obvious gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. You were amazing. Have you studied martial arts or something?" Before Sarah could answer, Frank the bartender called out that the police were on their way. Sarah knew she had minutes, maybe less, before law enforcement arrived and began asking questions she couldn't answer without compromising national security. She looked at Jake, who was now standing but still looking unsteady. Despite everything that had happened, she felt a strange sympathy for him. He was a veteran struggling with reintegration, dealing with his problems in unhealthy ways, but he wasn't truly evil. He was just a man who'd made a series of bad choices that had led to an encounter with someone far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Listen to me carefully," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer to Jake so the others couldn't hear. "You're going to tell the police this was a simple bar fight. You were drunk, you got aggressive with that woman, I tried to defend her, and things escalated. You slipped and fell, that's it. You don't mention anything about military training or combat techniques." Jake stared at her, trying to process what was happening. "Why, who are you?" Sarah glanced toward the door, calculating how much time she had before the police arrived. "Someone who's trying to keep both of us out of trouble we can't handle. If you start talking about military training and combat techniques, this becomes a much bigger investigation than either of us wants to deal with." The sound of sirens was getting closer now. Sarah knew she needed to leave, but she also knew that running would only make things worse. Instead, she made a decision that went against all her training but felt like the only option available. She was going to stay and face the police, maintain her cover story as best she could, and hope that her handler could contain any damage from the investigation that would inevitably follow. It was risky, potentially career-ending, but it was better than becoming a fugitive and definitely better than letting Jake spread the word that he'd fought with someone who demonstrated professional-level combat skills. As the police cars pulled up outside Murphy's pub, Sarah took a deep breath and prepared for the most important performance of her undercover career. Everything depended on convincing the responding officers that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a graduate student who'd gotten in over her head trying to help a stranger. She had no idea that her decision to stay would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a terrorist plot, save hundreds of lives, and fundamentally change both her life and Jake's in ways neither of them could have imagined. The first police officer through the door was Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran who'd seen every kind of bar fight imaginable. She looked around the room, taking in the broken furniture, the broken glass, the crowd of agitated patrons, and the two main participants in whatever had transpired. Sarah forced herself to tremble slightly and look shaken, the way a normal person would after being in a fight. Jake, for his part, was genuinely disoriented and in pain, which sold his part of the story perfectly. "All right, everyone," Detective Santos announced. "I need to know what happened here, and I need to hear it from the beginning." As witnesses began recounting their versions of events, Sarah realized that the real fight was just beginning. Everything she'd worked for over the past 3 months hung in the balance, and the terrorist cell she'd been tracking was still out there, planning an attack that could kill hundreds of innocent people. She looked at Jake one more time, wondering if he would honor her request to keep quiet about her obvious training, or if his sense of duty would compel him to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. The next few hours would determine whether Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen's career as an undercover operative was over before she could complete the most important mission of her life. Detective Santos had seen her share of bar fights, but something about this one felt different from the moment she walked through the door. The witnesses were all telling the same basic story. Drunk Marine harasses woman, college student intervenes, fight ensues, but the details didn't quite add up. The amount of damage to the furniture seemed disproportionate to what should have been a simple scuffle, and the main participants had an odd dynamic that suggested there was more to this story than met the eye. Sarah sat in the plastic chair at the local police precinct, her hands folded in her lap, projecting an image of nervous cooperation. She'd given her statement 3 times now, each time sticking to the same simple narrative. She was a graduate student who tried to help another woman and ended up in over her head. Detective Santos had asked probing questions about her background, her fighting experience, and where she'd learned to defend herself so effectively. But Sarah had deflected each inquiry with the kind of vague, slightly embarrassed responses that suggested amateur self-defense classes rather than professional training. 2 hours into the interview process, Sarah's biggest concern wasn't the police investigation. It was Jake Morrison. He'd been separated from her immediately upon arrival at the station, and she had no way of knowing whether he was maintaining the agreed-upon story or telling Detective Santos about his suspicions regarding her military background. If he started talking about combat techniques and professional training, it would open an investigation that could expose her true identity and destroy the mission she'd spent months preparing for. Jake, meanwhile, was struggling with a decision that felt impossible. He sat across from Officer Raymond Tucker, a younger cop who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the force. Tucker had immediately recognized Jake's military bearing and had been asking increasingly specific questions about his service record and combat experience. The conversation had naturally led to Jake's assessment of what had happened in the bar, and he found himself torn between his instinct to tell the truth and Sarah's warning about making the situation more complicated than either of them could handle. "Look, Jake," Officer Tucker was saying, "I've been where you are, coming back from deployment, trying to adjust to civilian life, maybe drinking a little too much to deal with the transition. I get it, but I need you to be straight with me about what happened tonight. That woman who fought you, there's something about her story that doesn't add up." Jake's leg was throbbing where the old shrapnel wound ached, and his shoulder still felt numb from whatever Sarah had done to him in those first few seconds of their encounter. He'd replayed the sequence in his mind dozens of times, and every analysis led him to the same conclusion. The woman who called herself Sarah had moved with the kind of precision and economy of motion that came from serious military training. Not weekend self-defense classes, but the real thing. "I was drunk," Jake said carefully. "Maybe things didn't happen exactly the way I remember them." Officer Tucker leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Jake, you threw a punch at her, and somehow you ended up on the ground with temporary nerve damage to your right arm. I've seen bar fights, and I've seen combat, and what happened to you required specific knowledge of pressure points and nerve manipulation. That's not something you pick up in a basic self-defense course." Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the interview room. He wanted to tell the truth. It went against every instinct he had as a Marine to lie to law enforcement, but Sarah's warning kept echoing in his head. Whatever was going on with her, she clearly had reasons for wanting to keep her real background secret, and those reasons might be bigger than a simple bar fight. "Maybe she got lucky," Jake offered weakly. "Like I said, I was pretty drunk, could have just lost my balance." Officer Tucker studied Jake's face for a long moment, clearly not buying the explanation but unable to prove otherwise. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go over your statement one more time, and then we'll see about getting you processed and released." While Jake wrestled with his conscience, Sarah was facing an even more immediate crisis. Detective Santos had just informed her that someone had posted video footage of the fight on social media, and it was already beginning to circulate. Tony's recording had captured most of the encounter, and while the lighting was poor and the angle wasn't perfect, it clearly showed Sarah's movements and technique. "The thing is, Sarah," Detective Santos said, consulting her notes, "we've had several people reach out to us after seeing this video online. People claiming they recognize your fighting style, saying you move like someone with serious training. One caller even suggested you might be military or law enforcement." Sarah's heart rate increased, but she forced herself to maintain the same nervous but cooperative demeanor she'd been projecting all night. "I took some karate classes in college," she said. "Maybe it looks more impressive on video than it actually was. I was mostly just scared and reacting on instinct." Detective Santos pulled out her phone and showed Sarah the video. "Take a look at this and tell me what you see." Sarah watched herself on the small screen, seeing the encounter from the perspective of Tony's camera. The footage was indeed grainy and poorly lit, but she could see why it was raising questions. Her movements were too controlled, too precise, too economical for someone who'd simply taken some karate classes. Every technique she'd used was textbook military combatives, designed for maximum effectiveness with minimum effort. "I don't know," Sarah said, handing the phone back. "It looks like a fight to me. I was just trying not to get hurt." Detective Santos pocketed her phone and leaned back in her chair. "Sarah, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've interviewed a lot of people who weren't telling me the complete truth. You seem like a good person who was trying to help someone in trouble, and I respect that. But I also think there's more to your story than you're letting on." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the interview room door. Officer Tucker entered, followed by a man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of quiet authority that made Sarah's blood run cold. She recognized the type immediately. Federal agent, probably FBI or military intelligence, someone with the clearance and resources to dig into backgrounds that were supposed to be classified. "Detective Santos," the man said, flashing credentials too quickly for Sarah to read them clearly. "I'm Agent David Reeves. I need to speak with Ms. Chen privately." Detective Santos looked confused but not surprised. In her experience, when cases involved potential military personnel or federal interests, it wasn't unusual for other agencies to insert themselves into local investigations. "Is this related to national security?" she asked. "I can't discuss the details," Agent Reeves replied smoothly. "But I can tell you that Ms. Chen's cooperation would be appreciated, and that the federal government has an interest in resolving this matter quietly." Sarah knew she was walking into a trap, but she also knew she had no choice. If Agent Reeves was legitimate federal law enforcement, refusing to cooperate would only make her situation worse. If he wasn't, and the timing of his appearance suggested he might be connected to her actual mission, then she needed to find out what he knew and who he represented. "Of course," Sarah said, standing up. "I'm happy to help however I can." Agent Reeves led her to a smaller, more private room within the police station. Once they were alone, his entire demeanor changed. The bureaucratic facade disappeared, replaced by the kind of direct, no-nonsense approach Sarah recognized from military briefings. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Sarah's cover was blown. The question now was how badly and whether there was any chance of salvaging her mission. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said automatically. Agent Reeves smiled grimly and pulled out a tablet, showing Sarah a series of photographs and documents. Her real military ID, photos from her graduation from Special Operations training, mission reports from previous assignments, all of it classified material that should have been accessible only to people with the highest security clearances. "Your handler sent me," Agent Reeves said simply. "Major Williams received word about the incident and dispatched me to perform damage control. We need to extract you from this situation before it compromises Operation Nightfall." Operation Nightfall was the code name for Sarah's current mission, something that should have been known only to a handful of people in the Pentagon. The fact that Agent Reeves knew about it suggested he was legitimate, but Sarah had been trained to be paranoid about exactly this kind of situation. "Show me your credentials again," she said, slowly this time. Agent Reeves obliged, presenting identification that marked him as a liaison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. The credentials looked authentic, but in Sarah's line of work, authentic-looking fake documents were easier to obtain than most people realized. "What's the verification code for Operation Nightfall?" Sarah asked. "Bravo 77 Alpha," Agent Reeves replied without hesitation. It was the correct code, updated weekly and known only to people directly involved in the mission. Sarah felt a wave of relief followed immediately by a new surge of anxiety. If her handler was already pulling her out, it meant the situation was considered too compromised to continue. "How bad is it?" she asked. Agent Reeves pulled up the social media video on his tablet and showed Sarah the comments section. "It's gone viral," he said. 2 million views in the last 3 hours, and several military personnel have posted comments identifying your techniques as advanced combatives training. There are already conspiracy theories about secret government agents and false flag operations." Sarah scanned the comments with growing dismay. Mixed in with the typical social media noise were several posts from people who clearly had military or law enforcement backgrounds, analyzing her movements frame by frame and speculating about her training. One comment from someone claiming to be a former Special Forces operator had identified 3 specific techniques she'd used and correctly assessed that they weren't taught in civilian self-defense courses. "What about the Marine?" Sarah asked. "Jake Morrison, how much does he know?" "That's actually why I'm here," Agent Reeves said. "He's been asking questions, and Officer Tucker is former military himself. They're putting together a picture that could expose not just you, but the entire operation. We need Morrison to stay quiet, and we need it to happen tonight." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly are you suggesting? Agent Reeves leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. Nothing permanent, he said quickly. But Morrison is a security risk that we can't afford. He needs to understand that his silence is a matter of national security, and he needs to believe that talking about this incident would have serious consequences for him personally. You want to threaten him, Sarah said flatly. I want to recruit him, Agent Reeves corrected. Morrison is a decorated Marine with combat experience and a clean record. His current employment situation is unstable, and he's struggling with the transition to civilian life. We can offer him something better, a chance to serve his country again in a way that gives his life meaning. Sarah understood what Agent Reeves was proposing. It was a classic intelligence operation. Turn a potential security risk into an asset by offering them something they wanted more than they wanted to expose the truth. Jake Morrison was vulnerable, unemployed, dealing with combat injuries, struggling with purpose and direction. The right offer at the right time could secure his silence and potentially gain the agency a useful resource. What kind of offer? Sarah asked. Consultant work, initially. Security assessments, background investigations, the kind of contract work that pays well and lets him use his military skills. If he proves reliable, there could be opportunities for more significant involvement in operations like yours. It made sense from a strategic standpoint, but Sarah found herself troubled by the idea of manipulating Jake's vulnerability for operational purposes. He was already dealing with the psychological challenges of reintegration. Getting him involved in intelligence work could either provide the purpose he was looking for or push him deeper into the kind of moral ambiguity that destroyed some operatives. And if he refuses? Sarah asked. Agent Reeves' expression hardened. Then we make it clear that discussing classified techniques and speculating about government operations is the kind of behavior that gets someone labeled as a security risk. That kind of label can make civilian life very difficult for a veteran trying to rebuild his career. Sarah recognized the approach. It wasn't about making explicit threats. It was about helping Jake understand the potential consequences of his choices and the benefits of cooperation. Done skillfully, he would feel like he was making his own decisions rather than being coerced. I want to be part of the conversation, Sarah said. If we're going to recruit him, he needs to trust that we're being honest with him. Agent Reeves nodded. Actually, that was already part of the plan. Morrison has been asking to speak with you specifically. Officer Tucker has been stalling, but we can arrange a meeting that gives us the opportunity to present our offer. 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself back in an interview room, this time with Jake Morrison sitting across from her and Agent Reeves positioned as an observer. Jake looked tired and confused, but there was an alertness in his eyes that suggested he knew this conversation was going to be significantly different from his earlier interactions with local law enforcement. Jake, Sarah began, using his first name to establish a more personal tone. I owe you an explanation. Jake leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly as his injured leg shifted position. Yeah, you do, starting with who you really are and why you can fight like that. Sarah glanced at Agent Reeves, who gave her a subtle nod. My name really is Sarah Chen, she said, but I'm not a graduate student. I'm a staff sergeant in the Army, currently assigned to a classified unit that handles special operations. Jake's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see recognition in his eyes. Special operations, he repeated. That explains the pressure point techniques and the combat throws. What kind of special operations? The kind where I can't give you details unless you're cleared to hear them, Sarah replied. What I can tell you is that I was working undercover when we met tonight, and your recognition of my training has created a security issue that my superiors need to address. Agent Reeves spoke up for the first time. Mr. Morrison, what Staff Sergeant Chen is trying to explain is that you've inadvertently become involved in a matter of national security. The techniques you witnessed tonight, the questions you've been asking, the speculation you've shared with Officer Tucker, all of it has the potential to compromise an ongoing operation. Jake looked back and forth between Sarah and Agent Reeves, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been anger. So this is the part where you threaten me to keep quiet about what I saw. Actually, Agent Reeves said, this is the part where we offer you a job. For the next hour, Agent Reeves outlined an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. contract work with a private security firm that handled overflow assignments for various government agencies. Good pay, flexible schedule, work that would utilize Jake's military background and give him the sense of purpose he'd been missing since his discharge. The kind of opportunity that could transform his civilian life from a series of dead-end jobs and purposeless drinking into something meaningful. "What's the catch?" Jake asked when Agent Reeves finished his presentation. "No catch," Agent Reeves replied. "Just an understanding that some of the work you'd be doing would be classified and that discussing it with unauthorized personnel would be a federal crime. The same way discussing what you witnessed tonight would be a federal crime." Sarah watched Jake's face as he processed the implications. He wasn't stupid. He understood that this was both a genuine opportunity and a sophisticated form of coercion. But she could also see that the offer appealed to him on a deeper level than simple financial security. Jake Morrison had been drifting since his discharge, and here was a chance to serve again, to be part of something larger than himself. "If I say no to the job," Jake asked, "what happens to the bar fight? Do you make it disappear?" "The bar fight stays exactly what it appears to be," Agent Reeves said. "A veteran who had too much to drink got into a scuffle with a college student who was trying to help someone. No charges are being filed, and everyone involved learned a lesson about the importance of walking away from confrontation. And if I take the job, then you learn that there are more ways to serve your country than you realized, and that some battles are fought by people who can never be acknowledged for their sacrifice." Jake was quiet for a long time, staring at the table while he thought. Sarah found herself hoping he would accept the offer, not just because it would solve her security problem, but because she genuinely believed it might be good for him. Jake Morrison struck her as someone who needed a mission, a purpose, something to channel his skills and experience toward positive ends. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said finally, looking directly at Sarah. "Was any of it real? The way you handled yourself tonight, standing up for that woman, was that really you, or was it just part of your cover?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "My cover identity was fake," she said, "but my reaction to seeing someone being mistreated was completely real. I couldn't have watched that and done nothing, mission or no mission." Jake nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, turning back to Agent Reeves. "Tell me more about this job." As Agent Reeves began outlining the specifics of Jake's potential new career, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had successfully contained the security breach and potentially gained a useful asset in the process. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they had also fundamentally altered the trajectory of Jake Morrison's life in ways that might have unintended consequences. More immediately, she needed to know what this meant for Operation Nightfall. Was her cover salvageable, or would she need to extract and start over with a new identity? "Agent Reeves," she said during a break in the conversation, "what's the status of my primary mission?" Agent Reeves checked his watch. "That depends on how quickly we can resolve this situation and get you back in position. Your target contacts are expecting to see you at the university on Monday morning. If you're not there, they'll start asking questions that could compromise the entire operation." Sarah realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the blown cover and the viral video and the security breach, she might still have a chance to complete her mission. But it would require perfect execution of the next phase of the plan, and it would require Jake Morrison to become a co-conspirator rather than simply a silenced witness. She looked at Jake, who was listening intently as Agent Reeves described the kind of background investigations and security assessments he might be asked to perform. He seemed genuinely interested, more animated than he'd been since she first saw him in Murphy's pub. "Jake," she said, interrupting the conversation, "how would you feel about helping with my current operation?" Both Jake and Agent Reeves looked surprised by her suggestion. It wasn't part of the planned recruitment approach, and it would mean bringing an outsider into an active classified mission. But Sarah had been thinking about the challenge of maintaining her cover after the night's events, and she was beginning to see possibilities that hadn't existed before. "What kind of help?" Jake asked. Sarah looked at Agent Reeves, who gave her a cautious nod to continue. "I need a reason to explain why I was so effective in that fight," she said. "Something that doesn't involve military training but still accounts for what people saw on the video." She paused, thinking through the logistics of what she was about to propose. "What if you've been teaching me self-defense? What if we've been dating for a few weeks, and you've been showing me some basic techniques because I mentioned feeling unsafe walking alone at night? Jake stared at her. You want me to pretend to be your boyfriend? I want you to be my cover story, Sarah corrected. A relationship with a veteran who's been teaching me self-defense would explain my techniques without raising questions about classified training. It would also give you a reason to be in my social circle, which means you could provide backup and surveillance support for the operation. Agent Reeves was nodding slowly, clearly working through the implications. It could work, he said. Morrison's military background is a matter of public record, so there's no security risk in acknowledging it. And having a local asset who can provide support without going through official channels could be valuable. What exactly would I be helping you do? Jake asked. Sarah and Agent Reeves exchanged glances. They were venturing into territory that went beyond damage control and into active recruitment of an unauthorized asset. It was risky, but Sarah's instincts told her that Jake Morrison might be exactly what Operation Nightfall needed to succeed. Help me stop a terrorist attack, Sarah said simply. Help me save lives. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing everything he'd learned against everything he'd thought he knew about his life and his future. Finally, he looked up with the kind of expression she recognized from soldiers who had decided to accept a dangerous mission. All right, Jake said, where do we start? 3 days after the incident at Murphy's pub, Sarah Chen walked across the university campus with Jake Morrison at her side, both of them playing their roles in a deception that could save hundreds of lives or get them both killed. To anyone watching, they looked like a typical graduate student couple, Sarah carrying a backpack full of chemistry textbooks, Jake walking with a slight limp that marked him as a veteran, both of them engaged in the kind of casual conversation that suggested comfortable familiarity. The transformation in Jake had been remarkable. Agent Reeves had worked with him for 48 hours straight, providing crash courses in surveillance techniques, communication protocols, and the kind of operational awareness that would keep him alive in situations he'd never been trained for. More importantly, they'd constructed a detailed backstory that would explain his presence in Sarah's life and account for her fighting abilities without raising suspicions about her true mission. According to their cover story, Jake and Sarah had met 3 weeks earlier at a coffee shop near campus. He'd been struggling with the transition to civilian life, taking odd jobs and trying to figure out his next move, when he'd struck up a conversation with the friendly graduate student studying molecular biology. They'd started dating casually, and when Sarah mentioned feeling unsafe walking alone at night, Jake had offered to teach her some basic self-defense techniques drawn from his Marine Corps training. It was a simple, believable explanation that accounted for both her skills and his presence in her social circle. More importantly, it gave Jake a legitimate reason to be around the chemistry department where Sarah's targets were operating, providing backup and surveillance capabilities that her handlers had never anticipated needing. Remember, Sarah murmured as they approached the science building, these people have been planning this for months. They're careful, paranoid, and extremely dangerous. If they suspect anything is wrong, they won't hesitate to accelerate their timeline or eliminate potential threats. Jake nodded, his expression serious. What's the worst-case scenario if they figure out who you really are? Sarah considered the question carefully. They detonate their device early, probably in a populated area on campus. Best estimates suggest casualties in the hundreds, possibly thousands depending on where they choose to target. The weight of that responsibility had been crushing Sarah for months, but now she found it oddly comforting to share the burden with someone else. Jake might not have her specialized training, but he understood the stakes and the pressure that came with knowing that innocent lives depended on your actions. They entered the chemistry building through the main entrance, and Sarah immediately spotted her primary target. Dr. Amira Nazir was a visiting professor from Pakistan who had arrived at the university 6 months earlier with impeccable academic credentials and a research proposal that had impressed the department enough to offer her a temporary position. What they didn't know was that Dr. Nazir was actually Amira Hassan, a chemist who had been radicalized during her studies in Europe and recruited by a terrorist organization that specialized in attacks using improvised chemical weapons. That's her, Sarah whispered to Jake as they passed Dr. Nazir in the hallway. The woman with the hijab talking to the tall man in the lab coat. Jake glanced casually in that direction and immediately understood why Sarah had been struggling to get close to the group. Dr. Nazir and her associates carried themselves with a kind of cautious awareness that suggested they were constantly evaluating potential threats. The tall man, Dr. Nazir's research assistant, who was actually a bomb maker with connections to terrorist cells in 3 different countries, had positioned himself where he could observe everyone entering and leaving the department. "They're professional," Jake observed quietly. "How long have you been trying to penetrate their operation?" 3 months, Sarah replied. "I've managed to establish myself as a trusted student assistant, but they've kept me away from their real work. I think they're planning to move soon, which means I'm running out of time to gather actionable intelligence." They continued down the hallway towards Sarah's assigned laboratory, where she spent her days maintaining her cover as a graduate student while trying to gather information about the terrorist cell's plans. The work was mind-numbing, processing routine samples and data that had nothing to do with her real mission, but it kept her in the building and gave her opportunities to observe her targets. "Sarah," the voice came from behind them, and Sarah turned to see Marcus Webb, one of Dr. Nazir's other student assistants, approaching with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Marcus was a 22-year-old chemistry major who had been recruited by the terrorist cell through online radicalization efforts. He believed he was helping to strike a blow against American imperialism, but he had no idea that his new friends were planning mass casualties rather than symbolic destruction. "Hey, Marcus," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "How's the research coming along?" "Great, actually," Marcus said, his eyes bright with the kind of fervor that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Dr. Nazir says we're making real progress on the project. She thinks we might be ready for the demonstration phase ahead of schedule." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The demonstration phase was code for the actual attack, and if they were moving ahead of schedule, it meant her window for stopping them was closing rapidly. "That's exciting," she said, maintaining her cover perfectly. "What kind of demonstration?" Marcus glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "I can't give you details here, but Dr. Nazir wants to show the university administration what we've been working on. She thinks it will convince them to increase funding for our research." Sarah's blood ran cold. The university administration meant multiple targets in a confined space, exactly the kind of high-value attack that would maximize casualties and media impact. If the terrorist cell was planning to target a meeting of university officials, they were looking at potential casualties that included some of the most prominent academic and political figures in the state. "When is this demonstration supposed to happen?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Soon," Marcus replied vaguely. "Dr. Nazir is still working out the logistics, but she wants everything ready by the end of the week." The end of the week was 4 days away. Sarah had been hopping for more time to gather intelligence and coordinate with her handlers, but Marcus's news meant she would need to accelerate her own timeline dramatically. "That sounds like a great opportunity," she said. "I'd love to be part of the demonstration if Dr. Nazir needs any additional help." Marcus looked uncertain. "I'll ask her, but she's been pretty selective about who gets involved in the final preparations. She says the demonstration needs to be perfect because we only get one chance to make an impression." After Marcus left them, Jake and Sarah continued to her laboratory in silence. Once they were safely inside the small, cluttered room that served as her base of operations, Jake immediately began checking for surveillance devices, while Sarah activated a signal jammer that would prevent anyone from monitoring their conversation electronically. "We need to call this in," Jake said quietly. "If they're planning to attack university administration, your people need to start coordinating with local law enforcement and emergency services." Sarah was already pulling out her encrypted communication device, a piece of equipment disguised as a standard smartphone that allowed her to contact her handlers through channels that were theoretically undetectable. But as she prepared to send her report, she realized they faced a terrible dilemma. "If I report what Marcus just told us, my handlers will want to extract me immediately and coordinate a preemptive strike against the terrorist cell," she explained to Jake. "That means arresting Dr. Nazir and her associates before they can carry out their attack." "That sounds like a good thing," Jake replied, looking confused. Sarah shook her head. "It would prevent this attack, but it wouldn't give us the intelligence we need to stop the next one. Dr. Nazir is part of a larger network that's been planning multiple attacks across the country. If we arrest her now, the rest of the network will disappear and we'll never find them. Jake understood immediately. It was the classic intelligence dilemma, stopping an immediate threat versus gathering information that could prevent larger future threats. The decision would ultimately be made by people with access to information and resources that went far beyond what Sarah could see from her position on the ground. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Sarah stared at the communication device, weighing options that felt impossible. "I want to try to maintain my cover for another 24 hours, she said finally. "Give me time to get inside their final preparations and identify their targets, their methods, and their connections to the larger network." "That's incredibly dangerous," Jake pointed out. "If they're planning to attack in 4 days and they're accelerating their timeline, you might not get another chance to extract safely." Sarah looked at him directly. "Are you willing to help me try?" Jake's answer came without hesitation. "Tell me what you need." Over the next several hours, Sarah and Jake developed a plan that was equal parts brilliant and completely insane. Instead of waiting to be invited into the terrorist cell's inner circle, they would create a crisis that forced Dr. Nazir to include Sarah in her final preparations. The plan centered on Jake's background as a combat veteran with knowledge of military security procedures. Using information that Agent Reeves had provided about the university's emergency protocols, Jake would create the appearance of a security threat that would force the terrorist cell to accelerate their timeline even further. In the chaos of responding to this fake emergency, Sarah would position herself as the only person capable of helping Dr. Nazir complete her preparations, giving her access to the information she needed to identify the full scope of the terrorist network. "The risk is enormous," Sarah explained as they finalized the details. "If Dr. Nazir realizes we're manipulating her, she'll either kill us immediately or detonate her device early as a last resort. And if we do nothing, she kills hundreds of people and disappears before we can identify her associates." Jake checked his watch. It was approaching evening, and the chemistry building would be emptying out soon. They had perhaps an hour to set their plan in motion before the opportunity disappeared. "I'm going to make some calls," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "Create the impression that there's been a security breach and that the administration is planning emergency meetings to discuss response protocols." While Jake worked on creating their crisis, Sarah began planting evidence that would support their deception. Using her access to the university's internal communication systems, she sent carefully crafted emails that suggested concern about potential security threats and the need for immediate action from university leadership. The plan was working perfectly until everything went wrong at once. Sarah was in the process of hacking Dr. Nazir's computer system when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her laboratory. She quickly closed the laptop and pretended to be working on routine sample analysis. But when the door opened, she found herself facing Dr. Nazir and 2 men she didn't recognize. "Sarah," Dr. Nazir said, her voice pleasant but her eyes cold. "I was hoping to find you here. We need to talk." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. The men with Dr. Nazir were positioned to block her escape routes, and their body language suggested they were prepared for violence. Something had gone wrong with their deception, and the terrorist cell had identified her as a threat. "Of course, Dr. Nazir," Sarah replied, forcing herself to remain calm. "What can I help you with?" Dr. Nazir stepped further into the laboratory, studying Sarah's face with the kind of intensity that suggested she was looking for signs of deception. "We've been monitoring communications traffic around the university," she said slowly, "and we've noticed some unusual patterns. Security alerts, emergency meetings, discussions about potential threats, all of it occurring just as we're preparing for our demonstration." Sarah's mind raced through possible responses, trying to find a way to maintain her cover without admitting knowledge of their plan. "I haven't heard anything about security alerts," she said. "Is there something I should be concerned about?" One of the men with Dr. Nazir stepped forward. He was tall, heavily built, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested extensive combat experience. "We know about your boyfriend," he said simply. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. If they had identified Jake as a threat, it meant their background research had uncovered something that compromised his cover story. "My boyfriend?" she repeated, trying to buy time while she calculated distances to possible weapons and escape routes. Jake Morrison, Dr. Nazir said. Former United States Marine, served 2 tours overseas, decorated combat veteran with specialized training in reconnaissance and surveillance. He's been asking questions about university security procedures and emergency protocols. Sarah realized that Jake's efforts to create their fake crisis had been too thorough. In trying to make their deception convincing, he had generated the kind of intelligence gathering that sophisticated terrorists would immediately recognize as suspicious. Jake's been worried about my safety, Sarah said, sticking to their cover story. He knows I work late in the lab sometimes, and he's been asking about security procedures because he wants to make sure I'm protected. Dr. Nazir smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps Mr. Morrison is not the unemployed veteran struggling with civilian life that he appears to be. The second man pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of photographs. Jake entering the police station 3 nights earlier. Jake meeting with Agent Reeves. Jake and Sarah walking across campus together with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested professional training. These photos were taken by associates of mine who have been watching you since you arrived at this university, Dr. Nazir explained. We've always been careful about security, but recent events have made us even more cautious. Sarah understood that her cover was completely blown. The only question now was whether she could extract herself and Jake from this situation alive, and whether she could gather enough intelligence to stop the attack, even if it meant compromising the larger mission. Dr. Nazir, she said carefully, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't think so, Dr. Nazir replied. She nodded to her associates, and both men moved closer to Sarah. I think you and Mr. Morrison are exactly what you appear to be, government agents attempting to infiltrate our operation. Sarah's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but she stopped when she heard Jake's voice from the doorway behind her. That's right, he said calmly. We're federal agents and this building is surrounded. Sarah turned to see Jake, standing in the laboratory entrance with his hands visible, but positioned where he could draw the concealed pistol Agent Reeves had provided him. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of military leadership, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Nazir said, seeming genuinely pleased to see him. How convenient. Now we can discuss this situation with all parties present. There's nothing to discuss, Jake replied. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts against the United States. Dr. Nazir laughed. Mr. Morrison, I think you misunderstand the situation. You and Agent Chen are outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from any backup that might be coming to assist you. As if to emphasize her point, Sarah heard movement in the hallway outside the laboratory. More footsteps, multiple people, the sound of equipment being moved into position. Dr. Nazir's associates hadn't just been watching Sarah and Jake. They had been preparing for exactly this confrontation. However, Dr. Nazir continued, I'm not an unreasonable person. You came here to gather intelligence about our operation, and I'm prepared to give you exactly what you want. Sarah and Jake exchanged glances, both of them recognizing that Dr. Nazir was setting some kind of trap, but unable to see what it might be. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Dr. Nazir walked over to a storage cabinet and began removing equipment that Sarah recognized as components for an improvised explosive device. Not the crude, amateur bomb she had expected, but sophisticated materials that suggested access to military-grade explosives and professional bomb-making expertise. You want to know about our demonstration, Dr. Nazir said as she assembled the device with practiced efficiency. You want to understand our targets, our methods, our timeline. I'm going to show you exactly what we've been planning. She attached a timer mechanism to the explosive device and set it for 30 minutes. In half an hour, this device will detonate with enough force to bring down this entire building. Everyone inside will die, including the 24 university administrators who are currently in an emergency meeting on the floor directly above us. Sarah felt sick as she realized what had happened. Dr. Nazir had used their fake crisis against them, turning their deception into a real emergency that had brought together exactly the kind of high-value targets the terrorist cell wanted to eliminate. The beautiful irony, Dr. Nazir continued, is that you created this opportunity for us. Your boyfriend's inquiries about security procedures caused the administration to call an emergency meeting to discuss potential threats. They're all here, right now, discussing how to protect the university from the very attack that's about to kill them. Jake stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Shut it down," he said. "Now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Dr. Nazir replied. "The device is armed with motion sensors and anti-tamper mechanisms. Any attempt to move it or interfere with its operation will cause immediate detonation." Sarah studied the device, drawing on her training in explosive ordnance disposal. Dr. Nazir was right. The bomb was sophisticated enough to include multiple fail-safes that would prevent unauthorized interference. But she also noticed something that gave her hope. The timer mechanism was electronic rather than mechanical, which meant it was vulnerable to the kind of electromagnetic interference that could be generated by the signal jammers she carried for secure communications. "Dr. Nazir," Sarah said, "you've made one mistake." "What's that?" "You assumed we came here alone." Sarah activated every electronic device she carried simultaneously: her communication equipment, her signal jammers, her electronic surveillance tools. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the overlapping signals was powerful enough to disrupt the timer mechanism on Dr. Nazir's device, buying them precious minutes while causing confusion among the terrorist cell. Jake used the distraction to draw his weapon and neutralize the two men with Dr. Nazir. His movements were precise and economical, the result of combat experience combined with the crash training Agent Reeves had provided. Within seconds, both terrorists were on the ground, unconscious but alive. Dr. Nazir reached for her own weapon, but Sarah was already moving. The fight was brief and decisive. Dr. Nazir was skilled, but she wasn't prepared for the level of combat training that Sarah brought to the encounter. As the dust settled, Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The electronic interference had disrupted the timer, but it had also triggered backup systems that were now counting down toward detonation. They had perhaps 10 minutes to evacuate the building and coordinate with emergency services. "Can you disarm it?" Jake asked, looking at the device. Sarah studied the bomb carefully. "Not safely," she said, "but I can isolate it and minimize the damage. We need to get everyone out of the building and establish a perimeter." Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah and Jake orchestrated the kind of emergency evacuation that they had trained for but never expected to execute. Using Jake's knowledge of military procedures and Sarah's access to university communication systems, they managed to clear the building and coordinate with local law enforcement and federal agents who had been standing by in case the operation went wrong. The bomb detonated exactly when Dr. Nazir had planned, but instead of killing dozens of university administrators, it destroyed an empty chemistry laboratory while emergency responders maintained a safe distance. The explosion was powerful enough to bring down part of the building, but careful evacuation procedures meant that no one was injured. In the aftermath, as federal agents processed the crime scene and arrested the remaining members of the terrorist cell, Sarah and Jake found themselves sitting on the steps of a nearby building, watching the controlled chaos of a successful counterterrorism operation. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. Sarah considered the question. "Now we find out whether the intelligence we gathered is enough to identify and arrest the rest of the network before they can plan another attack." Agent Reeves approached them, looking both relieved and impressed. "Preliminary analysis suggests that Dr. Nazir's computer systems contain detailed information about terrorist cells operating in at least 6 different cities," he reported. "This operation has potentially prevented attacks that could have killed thousands of people." Jake nodded slowly. "And what about us? Do we go back to pretending this never happened?" Agent Reeves looked at Sarah, who realized that she was facing the same kind of choice she had offered Jake 3 days earlier. She could return to her previous life, accepting new undercover assignments and continuing the work she had trained for, or she could embrace the partnership that had developed between her and Jake and see where it might lead. "Actually," Agent Reeves said, "there's been a development. The success of this operation has impressed some very important people, and there's interest in formalizing the kind of partnership you two have demonstrated." Sarah looked at Jake, seeing in his expression the same mixture of uncertainty and possibility that she felt herself. They had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they had ended as partners who trusted each other with their lives. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah asked. Agent Reeves smiled. "A new kind of operational team, deep cover partnerships that combine specialized military training with civilian integration capabilities. The kind of assignments where two people can accomplish things that larger teams couldn't manage." Jake stood up, offering Sarah his hand to help her to her feet. "Sounds dangerous," he said. "Extremely dangerous," Agent Reeves agreed. Sarah took Jake's hand and stood beside him, looking out at the emergency vehicles and the controlled destruction they had helped orchestrate. "When do we start?" she asked. 6 months later, Sarah Chen and Jake Morrison were walking through a marketplace in Eastern Europe, both of them playing roles in a new deception designed to infiltrate an arms trafficking network that was supplying weapons to terrorist organizations around the world. To anyone watching, they looked like tourists exploring local culture, but beneath their casual appearance lay the kind of partnership that had been forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. They had learned to work together with the kind of seamless coordination that saved lives and completed missions that others couldn't accomplish. More importantly, they had discovered that the best partnerships were built on trust, mutual respect, and the willingness to risk everything for something larger than themselves. As they disappeared into the crowd, beginning another chapter in their dangerous but essential work, Sarah reflected on the night that had changed both their lives. What had started as a misunderstanding in a bar had become the foundation for something neither of them could have imagined, a partnership that combined their individual strengths into something greater than the sum of its parts. Behind them, the marketplace continued its ancient rhythms of commerce and conversation, unaware that two of the most dangerous people in the world had just passed through, carrying secrets that could reshape the balance of power between those who sought to destroy and those who fought to protect the innocent. Their story was far from over, but they faced whatever came next together, as partners who had learned that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most important missions of their lives.